Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores the puzzles, challenges, transformations, and opportunities of our acceleratingly weird world. This week, I have the pleasure of sharing with you a conversation with David Weinberger of the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Technology, a philosopher and an author of several books, including the latest, Everyday Chaos, Technology, Complexity, and How We're Thriving in a New World of Possibility. Needless to say, these kinds of questions are directly in the center of my thematic bullseye for this show. And it was a lot of fun to sit down with David back in May. David, I apologize for taking so long to get this episode out. But it seems, as with all things, that if there is any lapse between recording and publication, the topics of these calls only get more imminent, resonant, and obvious. And this call is no exception. If you've been listening to Future Fossils for a while, you know how the question of the black box machine learning algorithm and, in general, the implications of AI to the way that we live, the way that we practice science and art and philosophy, these questions come up again and again on the show. And although I'm not exactly proud to admit this, they usually reflect the tension and the anxiety of our rapidly reorienting zeitgeist in this regard. One of the things I love about this conversation with David is his skill with a rhetorical technique that I often use myself, although strangely not in this category. He takes this situation that we believe to be radically new and qualitatively different from everything that has come before, and he embeds it in a continuous, big history that shows how the promise and peril of these profound new tools really just only amplify or democratize philosophical questions we've been facing for the entire history of humankind. Are we going to have to change the way we make stories about what it is that we know and how we know it? Yeah. But are those stories going to be more honest, more authentic than they have been? Also probably yes. I found David and his book, Everyday Chaos, to be a very refreshing and realistic, although also hopeful look at the outcome of this phase transition. But before we get into this talk, I just want to thank everyone who has been supporting this show on Patreon, including this week's newest supporter, Joshua Crowley. Thanks so much, Joshua, and to everyone else who has been helping me keep this show independent and ad-free over the last 3 years. Perks that went out to Future Fossils Patreon supporters this week include the hour-and-a-half book club call recording we had from last Sunday about Liu Cixin's amazing work of science fiction, The Three-Body Problem, which addresses, as science fiction, a lot of the same questions that David and I discuss in this conversation. Coming soon to the Patreon feed, new original music that I have labored on in the studio for over a year, new stickers, and also new phone wallpapers and other digital art goodies from my recent human-machine collaboration. Of course, I also post a ton of stuff on that feed for everyone publicly, so even if you don't have a few bucks to throw down on this show every month, please head on over to patreon.com/Michael Garfield and help yourself to all of the stuff I have released there under a Creative Commons license for the benefit of whomever happens to find it. We'll be doing another book club call in a couple weeks, and we have some awesome episodes coming up, including shows with Kevin Kelly, Eric Davis, the hosts of Weird Studies podcast. So I hope you'll subscribe if you haven't already. And that's all for now. Thanks a lot for sticking through this, and enjoy this fascinating conversation with David Weinberger about everyday chaos and thriving in an age of accelerating complexity. David, it's a pleasure having you on Future Fossils.
It's great to be here.
So, this book, Everyday Chaos, Technology, Complexity, and How We're Thriving in a New World of Possibility. I mentioned to people on Twitter today that this book so neatly overlaps with the kind of thinking that I've been giving these topics, but you do so in a way that is very approachable, that is very, I think, suited to an audience that doesn't have a stance in philosophy or the study of technology like you obviously do. And for that, I applaud you, because these are not simple ideas. So thanks for writing this book, first of all.
Sure. I mean, I have the advantage of not knowing very much, so I can't, I simply can't befuddle readers with the depth of my knowledge in either technology or philosophy, for that matter. I'm a writer, so.
Well, to that extent, I mean, you've been a writer in residence at Google, a senior researcher at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. I think you might be selling yourself a little short, but I'm not.
Well, we'll just see about that, Michael. We'll just see about that. That sounds like a challenge to me.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting thing, because I think, one of maybe the core theme of this book is that our technologies, specifically machine learning, have plunged us into an age where the sort of abstract philosophical matter of what it is to know a thing and how we understand the relationships between things and the sort of fundamental mystery at the root of our knowledge is now front and center in society. And, I'd be curious to hear from you why you felt the desire to write this book, why you felt like this particular shift in our framing was or is so important.
Well, that's actually a really nice presentation of what the book is about. I wish I were taking notes. That would have been really
it's
helpful.
On record.
Okay, good. So the book started out one way, and then it went another way. Because in the sense of actually writing a book, doing research and writing, it took at least 6 years. In terms of the topics that this talks about, these are topics that I've been interested in basically forever. It started out fundamentally as a book about a change in how the future happens, or how we think the future happens. An interest of mine since at least grad school, and I'd certainly say before as well. I was co-director of the Harvard Library Innovation Lab for 4 or 5 years, and it was a set of developers, still is, a set of developers who at that point were free to come up with whatever innovative project they wanted. And my project was to oversee the building of an open platform for the Harvard Library, for the metadata about the contents of that library, which are vast. It's a great library. And so I spent a few years working on this open platform called Library Cloud. And it just really impressed upon me how weird it is that people build open platforms. I am thoroughly in favor of it. But it's like so much on the internet. It's just a great thing to do, but it's really bizarre. It flies in the face of so many assumptions that we've had, in some cases for thousands of years. But we just go ahead with it as if it's nothing. And the book it started out as an exploration of some of those internet weirdnesses, especially with regard to what I thought and still think is a change in how we approach the future and how we think the future works. But at the same time, I was getting really interested in AI, and in particular machine learning, which seemed to me to be sort of finishing the job that the internet was doing in terms of how we think about the future. So I actually haven't said what I think that change is. So here's the spoiler. I spilled the guts in the first chapter, so no spoiling going on here. The thing that impressed me about platforms is a really straightforward thing. I mean, it's a really obvious thing. Fundamentally what they do, which is to take some set of data and services that a library or a company or an organization is offering over the internet, and makes them available to anybody on the web who wants to use them. Some developers, typically. These are open APIs, with the idea that, we don't know what people are going to do with it, so let's make it. That conjunction is really unusual in our history. We don't know what people are going to use it for, so let's go to some real trouble and expense in order to make and maintain this thing. And it's not just open APIs, but so much that's distinctive of the internet and that we take for granted on the internet has the same characteristic of seeing virtue and benefit in not anticipating what will happen and setting up the conditions by which unexpected things can happen. And this is, in effect, purposefully making the world less predictable. And that's really not how we have proceeded for thousands of years. We did the opposite. In fact, sort of a Paleolithic strategy has been and the basic strategy that we've had is to anticipate what the future is going to be, and then make preparations to take advantage of it. Anticipate and prepare. And obviously, we still do that. We'll always do that, because otherwise you don't look both ways when you cross the street and you die pretty quickly. But here we had an environment in which there seemed, in multiple different ways, to offer benefit to holding back from anticipating, and even from sort of unanticipating what will happen. So open platforms are one example, minimal viable products are another, where you purposely do not try to anticipate everything that your market is going to want from your product, and ship it with the fewest features that people will pay for and find useful. Open source, open access. The things that are game modding, back to the early 1980s, this is maybe the earliest just on PCs. Anyway, commercial games would one way or another permit, or sometimes even encourage and enable, users to create new versions of the game, new maps for the game, new rules for the game. All of this is obvious. It's all, I think, obviously really good and helpful, but it's not obvious in our history. And it changes, I think, our ideas about how we succeed, how we move forward, not just by anticipating, but there's real value in sort of holding back from unanticipating.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, you do a good job in this book of laying out the history of prediction in the first couple of chapters. And obviously this notion that prediction requires us to have some, but not total knowledge, enough that we feel that we can identify regularities, that these regularities led to the creation of universal laws. And that at some point it's starting as you did with the three body problem, Edmund Halley's request of Newton to help him track this comet, and that even three bodies in an age before computers was too many, and that was sort of the thin end of this wedge that led us to where we are today, where machine learning as a tool is capable of these extraordinary predictions that are essentially theoryless, that we don't have an abstracted explanation for how this prediction is actually making any sense. And it's hard for us to extrapolate from one prediction to another simply because there are so many factors. And so that specific thing, I think, sort of our increasing knowledge of the immense complexity of the world that we abstract into these cause and effect just so stories, basically. It's an elegant history that you have here about, the centuries of thinking that led to the notion that laws are not necessarily the most accurate way of describing reality. And I would love to, you give a great example with A/B testing, and I'd love to hear you lay that a little bit out, because I think that forms a sort of a philosophical basis for the rest of the kinds of questions that you bring up in this.
Yeah. So A/B testing and all this stuff I was just saying about unanticipation are internet phenomena. And in both cases, I'll get to A/B testing in just a second, our comfort with not anticipating the future in all of these different ways that we do on the internet. And one, in fact, could say that the internet itself, the thing that makes it the internet is that it is a vehicle for interoperability, for enabling pieces to work together without having to know ahead of time what other systems are going to be used in. That's the internet allows this sort of vast sharing of data of all kinds without knowing ahead of time what it's going to be used for. This gets us, I think, comfortable with operating, has gotten us comfortable with operating in an environment without always knowing how things are going to work. In fact, holding back from knowing how things are going to be used. That's what, anticipation tries to run ahead and figure out what's going to happen. Unanticipation says, no, actually, we get more benefit if we just throw open this world, whether it's, games or it's open platforms or open source or whatever. We will all do better if we just throw this open because we don't know what's going to be done with it. And A/B testing is, widely used on the internet because it's very effective and it's very cheap. As I don't know who knows what. So just to be clear, in A/B testing, a marketer puts up two, sometimes more, two versions of an ad that often have very slight differences. So it might be that in one, the model is on the left, the other model, the model is on the right, or the background is green instead of red or whatever. So tweaks. And you show that to the first, 100,000 people who come by in a scaled environment. And you just see which ad gets more clicks. And if one gets 2% more clicks, well, good, you just made 2% more money. And you go with that one. The thing that's, I think, remarkable about A/B testing is that there, as far as I know, there are no theories about what those small random-like changes should be when you're putting up an ad. So you put up an ad for your indoor barbecue, and it shows a skinny guy on the right flipping burgers, and it turns out that gets 2 or 3% more clicks than having a skinny guy on the left turning hot dogs. So you go with one, but nobody tries to come up with a theory that says, okay, when you're selling barbecues, make sure you put the skinny model on the right with the burger. There's no reason to, because you don't know if the next day you're doing a related ad, let's say for an outdoor barbecue. Was the first one an indoor barbecue? In any case, so related ad, and you don't know that the same variations are going to have the same effect. You also don't know, I think the world is a different world tomorrow. We don't know, and nobody cares, because the economics of it are such that just run another A/B test. And we don't even bother trying to derive general rules of it. So this, I think, also, this is an indication. It both gets us used to and indicates our increasing comfort with proceeding without even bothering to try to come up with an hypothesis. And it may be that in this case, the factors that influence the 2% difference, the delta of 2%, are so complex and small and interrelated and transient that, we're not going to know what those things are anyway. And we don't even have to bother. Just run another ad, another A/B ad. Why would you want to understand? Just, abstractly, maybe you do, but there may not be a general law of left or right placement of barbecue ads.
So this is an interesting place here. I think a lot about what it is that we're doing with science and what it is that we're trying to do with science. And the world that you're painting in this book is a world in which the goal of science that I was taught, that I grew up with believing was this destination of human intellectual enterprise, was a theory of everything, a single cognitive framework, vast and unifying and capable of explaining the puzzling diversity of phenomena. But you're making a pretty strong case here that what's happening is that the more variables we realize have some meaningful influence. You spend a lot of time in this book invoking chaos theory and stuff like the so-called butterfly effect, this notion that these there are these small differences that lead to enormous effects through these cascades across scales. And that, at least my understanding of chaos theory is that we're living in a deterministic universe, that Lorenz, who, put out this sort of notion about the butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, causing a hurricane in Texas back in the 70s, Lorenz was convinced that we're living in a deterministic cosmos, but a cosmos about which our imperfect knowledge makes our ability to model it deterministically futile. And I feel like you're taking it even a step further in this book, and you're suggesting, your chapter 4 is beyond causality. So, I mean, what do you see as the promise that science in the 21st century can actually keep here?
Well, that's an easy question. I'm terrified of this entire topic because I 100% do not want to be taken as saying that theory is not necessary, that theories are all wrong, that science should give up. I mean, I like science, and especially these days, I want more and more and more of it. So, on the other hand, I will give the spoiler for chapter 4, because beyond causality is a pretty daunting. It's hard to deliver on that. And now that when you read it back to me, I realize just the impossible promise that makes. And that chapter is about interoperability. So it's not going to deliver on some grand theory of causality. Instead, the chapter, I will get to your question, which terrifies me in a second, just to finish off about it.
Take your time. This is a nonlinear show for sure.
Yeah. Oh, good. The book talks about interoperability, the use of a piece designed for one system in other systems where its uses are not anticipated, as, first of all, a fundamental property of the internet, and second of all, as being hugely generative, to use the phrase that Jonathan Zittrain at the Berkman Klein Center that I'm at has used. And it's a world that is characterized by interoperability is it's the same world, but our view of it and what counts and what we look to in trying to understand or to not understand things. I think the key difference is that with causality, we know basically how things causally interact. I mean, Newton was pretty good at that, and it's gotten only better since then, more precise and more accurate and fuller. But Newton was discovering laws. We'll get to laws in a second. With interoperability, we can make up our own laws for how things interact. And we do this all the time. It's a fundamental action on the internet is to design how we want two pieces of data or two represent images or whatever. How we want an image to interact with our email system. Do we want to allow, when you drag it in, what's going to happen? Is it going to embed in the email or be attached, right? All of the rules of interaction we get to design in this digital world. That sense, I think, may be changing our view out into the world overall. So that's the only sense of beyond causality. I don't have a super causality theory, unfortunately. I forgot to be Newton. That was my problem. So I would be very distressed if what I say in the book was taken, especially by ill-spirited people, as permission to beat up on or disregard science. I would be very, very unhappy if that's what people took away from the book. So I don't want to dispute the existence of laws and of theories that are both useful and elegant, but they're not the only things in the world. So you can have and I'm going to go back to the three-body problem, which was so complex that Newton just didn't want to spend the time on it because he had other things to think. Haley wanted to know if the thing that he thought was a comet, when it would be coming back if it were a comet, which required computing the path through some Saturn and Jupiter and the sun also exerting its pull. So you can mechanically figure that out, and some French aristocrats actually spent a summer doing that. They built a table and just recomputed in order to, and basically they succeeded at it, figuring out when the comet would reappear. But it's not really a three-body problem; it's an everybody problem. Because as Newton knew better than anybody, since he's the one who formulated this, all masses, everything with gravity affects everything else, every other mass. I mean, but we don't care about the action of distant stars when trying to figure out what month Halley's Comet is going to return. So we ignore it. It's totally proper. But the reality is everything is interacting with everything else all the time. We didn't need to account for it because, the comets are you don't need all that tiny amount of gravitational pull to factor that in. And we couldn't handle hugely complex problems like that, huge collections of influences. But now we can. We can't handle the entire universe. And I'm not thinking now about three-body problems or paths of large objects, but in the course of our daily lives. We have now machine learning systems, that handle way more data than a human brain can, or even 3 French aristocratic brains can over the course of the summer, and can find relationships that we otherwise would not have found. Those relationships may well be governed by laws, just the way when you walk down a street and I'll put it like this. I'm sorry, I'm rambling badly. So let me back up and try to start from the other end. We have grown up with a particular model in mind that we were taught, which is to understand something, that there's a handful of laws that happen to be simple enough for human beings to understand, that govern the behavior of the universe. Therefore, when we think about how to explain things and what's real about the world, we tend often, I think, to think about large principles, and we do this when thinking about physical causality. But we also do it in other realms as well. We have a long tradition of thinking about morality in terms of large principles, eternal principles. So we like these laws to be eternal. At least in the West, we do. And meanwhile, all that's I think right and true. I'm not going to dispute it. I wouldn't and couldn't and shouldn't that. Nevertheless, when you go to work in the morning, you cannot predict that the person next to you on the subway is going to be wearing a Beyonce t-shirt, and you can't predict that when you can't predict exactly when the train's going to get there. You can get an approximation, but you can't predict it exactly, or exactly where it stops, so you know exactly, so the door is directly in front of you. And you get to work, you don't know if the coffee's going to be hot or not. You don't know if there's going to be any left, or if somebody broke the canister last night and there's no coffee. You don't know that one of your colleagues is going to show up with sniffles or with a new sweater. I mean, everything in our lives we don't know and basically cannot predict. But our picture of the world has been, until I think recently, it's simple and law-like. That can be true, and yet our experience isn't like that. The picture that chaos theory paints, I think, is a far, far more accurate and realistic picture of our lives. That's what I think maybe will be happening, in part thanks to our plunging into the chaotic world of the internet, and both profiting from it and really, really liking it. And from the new sort of model that machine learning gives us, it may be that we'll be able to better validate our own experience. And instead of writing off everything that happens in our lives as a series of accidents, some happy, some not happy, most indifferent, we'll be able to more firmly say, oh, yeah, this is life. The chaos is the life. And the laws they're real, they're helpful, but they actually don't govern as much of our lives as we used to think.
Yeah, there is something in this book that seems very resonant with a piece that I'm frequently invoking on this show that Kevin Kelly wrote for his blog years ago on the expansion of ignorance. The notion that every scientific question answered raises numerous follow-up questions. And so we're actually, like, in some sense, what we're really doing here is expanding the known unknown, expanding the area of our admitted ignorance. And that we're, the exponential curve of knowledge is being outpaced by an even steeper exponential curve of mystery, a confrontation with the unknowability of our world. And, that I find, your work really humble in that it's actually probably one of the only things I've ever seen that you seem not to lose sleep at night about the fact that we don't really understand what's going on inside, so-called under the hood of a high-performing deep learning algorithm like the AlphaGo algorithm that beat the world Go masters. Like that. A lot of people nowadays, myself included, I think, have been preoccupied with a concern that. And there are, to be fair, there are real sort of social implications for deploying algorithms that we don't understand, especially when those algorithms are assisting in the decision making or making the decisions for us in terms of who gets screened at the airport security line, how long your sentence is when you're sentenced to some sort of criminal justice conclusion. That these, the fact that we don't understand how these things achieve the results that they do is, to, I think, the sort of modern reason, enlightenment, self-authoring kind of personality deeply disturbing. And it seems like, that we're at a point now where if we have an algorithm that finds a new mathematical proof that we don't understand, and we have to write another algorithm to help us translate the inner workings of the first algorithm, that we're just creating this system where we're back to Oracle of Delphi type. We're just consulting the magic box, and yet. You make a really good case that this is actually a more authentic relationship to our dizzyingly complicated world, and also that it's approaching the world this way almost seems like the wisdom of biomimicry, because it seems as though this type of process, and I'm really curious, whether what you think about this in a sort of a broader picture beyond the story of the human historical development of technology. But it seems as though this kind of emphasis on interoperability and on emergence, rather than on the anticipation and the control of a law-like world, that this is the difference that we have traditionally assigned to human intelligent design of the world of our artificial objects and institutions and so on, and how evolution itself works as a blind improvisational process that is highly dependent on recombination and remix. And, like Stephen Jay Gould's delicious word for this, exaptation, taking something out of that initial context of its origin and into some new context where it demonstrates some powerful, new, surprising properties. So, like, I guess, first of all, do you think that we're dispensing with a sort of foolish, if not outright harmfully wrong way of looking at the world in this transition? And then also, how do you understand it in terms of this sort of bigger story about how we see nature, quote unquote, processing information and generating novelty in the same kind of a way? Maybe that's too big of a question, but you can bite any piece of it and I'd be happy.
It's too big for me. So I'm going to go back towards the beginning of what you were talking about, which was really, really interestingly put. So I really like the work of Andy Clark, a Scottish philosopher, contemporary. I guess the name Andy probably isn't 17th century. He's a philosopher and he's a computer scientist, and his work has become very influential. It's a great New Yorker article about him from a few months ago. So they don't do a lot of profiles of philosophers. And he says this, my philosophical, my dissertation was on Heiddeger, and Clark sort of starts from that standpoint and says something that just seems so obvious as soon as he says it, but wasn't obvious to me until he said it. I mean, I reacted thinking, yeah, no, that's right. And then realized I didn't know that before he said it, which is the best sort of insight, I think. So he says, we think out in the world with our tools. And if you take tools away from people, they're the tools they use for thinking, they can't think. You take the whiteboard away from the physicist and she can't do her work. You take the abacus away from the merchant at one point and he can't do his sums. You take away paper and the poet can't write. We think out in the world with tools. There's no shame in this. It sounds like, to some people, I think it sounds demeaning. But it does mean that we're not locked in our own heads with thoughts trying to figure out the world. No, this is something that we do with tools. And now we have new tools. And I think a lot of what I've written over the past 25 years is about what happens to how we think when we have these new tools. The first new tool being the internet, and the second new tool now being machine learning. Machine learning is in fact, I think, inexplicable machine learning, and obviously not all of it is inexplicable. So let's say black box, because it's simpler to say. Black box machine learning has this pretty unusual possibility. You mentioned the Oracle at Delphi. The Oracle also had this characteristic, which is you can't interrogate it. Our other machines, including our machines for thinking, something goes wrong, you can take it apart, look at it, and probably figure out what went wrong. You can debug a computer program. Black box computing, when it's working, and you want to know how it works, by definition, you can't. Now I understand there's controversy among computer scientists. Many of them say that we have inexplicability on the run, and it's just sort of a temporary problem here at the dawn of the machine learning. Oh, I'm surprised you're laughing.
I mean, it just sounds, to anybody who listens to this show, I think they'll, I think that's just a pitiable perspective, frankly. I mean, you address the paradox of being able to predict more and more effectively, and also being sort of less and less willing to anticipate, and more needing to hedge our bets. I think that's the real trend that I see here. And so anybody who's convinced that we're going to chase down the last sort of squiggles here is fooling themselves. Just not honest with what we know about neuroanatomy and so on. But anyway,
I want to be sure I'm being clear. I'm talking about machine learning, not human brains.
Oh, totally. Of course. But I mean, it's, you talk about Heiddeger, it has more to do with, the inaccessibility of some true thing about the object itself, instead of the way that these objects appear to us. I think the black box machine learning is an instance where we're being forced to confront and reconcile the vast unconscious, of which the knowable world is just sort of the visible tip, right? So I don't mean to conflate those things, but I do think that yeah.
I am not a computer scientist. I don't have a dog in the race, a pony in the race, a dog in the fight. I don't know. And these are people that I respect, and my untutored guess, which is not even worth uttering, but I will anyway, is that I sort of think that it's going to come down to that we will continually make progress in coming up with explanations that do the job that we need. But I think the definition of what constitutes an explanation is going to be a moving target. So we'll say, well, we've explained, I'll give you an example in a second, but we'll say, okay, well, no, new technique. Now we've explained this black box. And there will be some truth in that, but it depends upon what you count as an explanation. I think that it may come down to a metaphysical sense, belief that the world is just such a place that there are a handful of laws and forces suffice to explain everything that happens, versus a belief in, I want to say again, of course I believe in the laws that science discovers, but they are not enough to explain what goes on because of the complexity of the starting positions of the objects in the universe. This is, Laplace's demon, right?
Go into this. This is a great part of the book where I would love to.
Well, so Laplace was another unbelievable genius, like Newton, and was called the Newton of France, but I think in French. So I won't try to do my French accent for you. He, incredible genius, and among other things, he sort of drew the conclusion that Newton didn't want drawn for theological reasons, which is, if you knew the position of every item in the entire universe and its acceleration and the rest of it, you could apply Newton's simple laws in order to predict what the next state of the universe would be. And you could do this repeatedly and thus have a completely predictable universe. And you could do it backwards as well. You could read off how we got here. And philosophically, I think there are iffy things about this, but I think the fundamental point is right. That is, well, I'll go with that. I think the fundamental point is right. It would take that sort of demon, all-knowing God, in order to do it. It's not a possibility for us. But so underneath the chaos, there may well be. I'm happy to believe that there are universal laws that are governing each movement of each thing. And conceptually, that's appealing. Practically, of course, it doesn't help us because we are not omniscient creatures. The world is just too complex. There's also, I think, I'm not sure if Laplace's demon knows about nonlinearity, but probably, would account for that as well. Newton didn't want to go down that path because Newton was a very, very faithful person. And he did not like the idea of a universe in which there really was no need for God once God wound up the clock. Everything's in place, the laws are in place, and he can just retire and watch. And that having a God who's not actively involved in the universe was just an unacceptable idea to him. I mentioned in the book that Newton speculates. It's nothing more than sort of an idle thought that maybe comets, which were a very interesting phenomenon at the time, served a purpose, a divine purpose, because the beautiful elliptical orbits, because of the tug of everything in the universe on the planets, they eventually would go out of orbit. And so maybe God throws a comet now and then at precisely the right way, the right curve, in order to tug the planets back into their proper elliptical orbits. He didn't put this forward as a scientific theory, but it passed his mind. He was struggling to find a way to keep God in the picture. Laplace was a famous atheist, and so no need for a God, you just need the machine. I don't think you have to deny the machine to say, well, first of all, that's not how we live our lives, because we're not a demon who knows everything. The demon is not evil in this case. It's, I think, instead of having to call this thing a God, which would be slightly blasphemous perhaps. Anyway, you can believe that there is this sort of mechanical, there are laws and there's stuff, and still say we need to leave room for the particular and for what we call the accidental, because that is the stuff of our lives. Now, before I go on, sorry, I think it's really important to take seriously the danger that you brought up, using machine learning systems, which almost by their nature are going to be biased because they're learning from data. That data reflects social conditions, and our societies are horribly biased in all sorts of ways. And so, yeah, machine learning learns those biases unless you intervene and are very careful in a number of different ways. When you compound that with systems that are inexplicable, you may not be able to tell that the bias is operating. And if it is, you may have difficulty getting rid of it. But I'm not convinced that is. So I take those dangers really seriously, and the examples that you give are really good ones. It would be perfectly reasonable, from my point of view, to say, okay, maybe we don't want machine learning to be sentencing convicted criminals to jail terms for all the reasons that people bring up, starting with the systemic bias that the data that they're learning from contains. But then there are other issues as well, including the importance of things that are probably hard to program into a system like leniency. So that's fine. If we want to say, no, don't want to use it there. On the other hand, if it turns out, and in one study it did, I wouldn't make too much of it, but that the sentences that are being suggested by machine learning recommendation systems in the judicial system, if it turns out that those sentences are actually exhibit less bias than the sentences that are being given out by human judges, then maybe we ought to think about whether there's a role for AI in that system. Taking over from the judge, that seems pretty far-fetched. Flagging to the judge that, do you know that your sentences are really out of skew with fair judges, non-racist judges? You might want to consider that. That might be useful for, but I think these are really, really. We're going to have. I'm sorry. I need to say a couple of things about this.
Yeah.
Started so long. We're going to have to puzzle through in a social and political and moral way where we want to use these systems, and we absolutely have to be open, as increasingly I think people are, to the possibility that there are places where this stuff needs to be carefully constrained or just not used because there's real damage that can be done with it. But there are other ways of judging whether a system is behaving fairly, living up to our human standards of fairness. And if it's not, there are other ways, other than insisting on explicability, to getting these systems within the constraints of fairness and other moral principles that we hold dear. For example, I say this because there is increasing sort of a mantra coming from regulators in various parts of the world that these systems need to be explicable. They need to be transparent. We need transparent algorithms. I truly believe that the people who are demanding this, in many instances, not all of them, of course, the regulators have no idea what an algorithm is, because I'm not sure what I don't think I really know what a transparent algorithm is when you come right down to it. Very often the problem is going to be with the data, not with the algorithm. Nevertheless, so if you're designing a system of autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, using machine learning, which is how it's done, in order to drive down primarily to drive down the number of fatalities on the road. But there are a series of other things you'd also like them to accomplish, like fuel efficiency. You want to have some minimal level of comfort for passengers, because otherwise they won't get in the cars and you won't get the benefits that you won't get the fuel efficiency and the safety efficiency and so forth. There's a whole set of things you want to accomplish. You can, if these systems work best as black boxes, let's just pretend that's the case. You can judge, you can insist on transparency, not necessarily of the algorithms, but about the outcomes. You want to know how many people are killed, how many near misses were there, all the different sorts of metrics that you would want. These machines presumably they can't do all of them because they're broader issues. Nevertheless, you can look at the effects of what they're doing in a systemic way, and you can require that these systems publish those metrics. You can insist, if we wanted to, we could insist on the makers telling us what the cars are optimized for. They'll all be optimized for fewer deaths on the highway. Let's just assume that. But how important is it to the machine learning system to drive down the environmental impact versus, say, comfort versus, say, speed? And it could well be that a car, an AV, that is delivering its goods or its passengers as quickly as possible, because that's something generally we want. Economically, we almost always want that requires less fuel efficiency than if they drove 20 miles an hour. So we could at least ask the manufacturers to tell us what the things are optimized for, what are the values that it's trying to achieve, and then what the results are. And if the AVs go out of, they're not achieving what we've agreed they should be optimized for, then they're a faulty product and they need to be fixed. But as with most faulty products, I am not a lawyer, but my understanding, we get a new batch of them and we test them to see if the product's been solved. We don't always, anyway, insist on getting an explanation of what went wrong. And we could do the same thing with AVs. If the manufacturer fixes them, then we don't need to know. I don't think we don't need to know how they tuned it in order to fix it. We do not demand transparency from all of our products. And this again is something that computer scientists I respect tell me is a false trade-off. But if it is the case in some instances that explicability, keeping the systems explicable, will also damage their efficiency in achieving the goals we set for them. Imagine just for a moment that that's the case. Then we may well want to, let me put it like this, and I think many machine learning people are just going to tear their hair out when I say this, but imagine if you will.
Only if they're listening.
Imagine that making autonomous vehicles completely explicable. The price of that is less fuel efficiency and more highway deaths. And maybe not all that many more. It's just 1,000 more. Like there are 35 to 40,000 highway deaths a year in the U.S. So, 1,000 dead people. Would we be willing to sacrifice 1,000 people in order to get a type of transparency and explicability that may not be useful to us? If an inexplicable system can save 1,000 lives, would we be willing to do it? I have my feelings about it, but this is a sort of question that should be settled in public. I think it would be going to be hard to sell the public on another 1,000 people dead because we want theoretical explicability. If there are other ways of achieving the goals that we want. So one more thing if you don't mind, about explicability.
You're the guest.
Well, but you're the host.
Please.
You are the boss of me.
Please.
But now you're begging. That's just, there's no dignity here anymore. So, sorry. So there's, I think, a really good idea comes from the Oxford Internet Institute and also at the Berkman Klein Center. There have been people who have written a paper along the same lines, I think simultaneous, that says, here's a really good technique for making systems explicable without having to expose all of the inner workings, which manufacturers may want to do for trade secret reasons and because it's complex. So it's really simple. In many instances, if you want to know if the system is rejecting loans because of the gender of the applicant, then feed in the same applications, but change only one datum. Change the gender. And if these loans that were rejected because when they were marked as female, coming from a woman, now are accepted because they're coming from a man, you have pretty good counterfactual evidence that, this system is noticing gender and is penalizing women for it. They're clearly not acceptable. That seems like a really good idea to me. It seems pretty straightforward. But it seems to me that that's not an explanation. It is in some sense an explanation. I'm sorry, let me be really careful. So it's why did it turn you down? Because you're a woman. That is, it's a bad reason, but it's a good explanation. But it's not an explanation in the sense that my book is thinking about them. Because the book is about, fundamentally, I think, it's about how we tend to understand ourselves in terms of the technology, the tools that we use. We've been doing this for a long time. Certainly have done it in the computer age, where we suddenly started looking like computers, and we did it in the steam age when we started feeling under pressure and letting off steam and having to vent and all this sort of stuff. And it goes back further than that. So if we are understanding ourselves in machine learning terms, the relevant inexplicability of black box AI has to do with the number of variables and the insanely complex interrelationships among them. That's the new model that replaces the old model that says, oh, there's all this crazy stuff that's happening, little pieces of dust and big planets, but it's all governed by a relative handful of relatively simple laws. The new model doesn't deny that, but says, here's how it works. You have thousands, tens of thousands, millions of pieces of data and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of variables, of features, an insane number of connections, some of which very small change will trigger a very large effect. Usually not, but sometimes that happens. Sometimes it will take many small factors turn out to have a determinative or even large effect. That's what the world is like. An explanation, finding out that one of the variables was gender and that caused the system to flip, that's really important. That does exactly what we generally want an explanation to do, which is an explanation is a tool. It's not a state of the world. It's not a feature of the world. An explanation is a tool that we use to do something. If you get a flat tire, the explanation is there was a nail in it. That's an excellent explanation. But that nail only got there because of a huge set of other factors that had to be in place that range from the road that you were on, whatever the circumstances were that put the nail there. Facts like pointy objects penetrate better than dull ones, and that metal will penetrate rubber tires, that there's gravity. I mean, basically everything in the universe had to happen for you to get that flat tire. The reason we pick on the nail as the sine qua non, as the there but for the nail, and that's the explanation. The reason we pick on the nail is that's the thing we can change. We can't change gravity. We can't change the past that we happen to be on this road where the nail was, or the past that brought the nail onto the road. That's all part. Those are all equal parts of the explanation. They are how the world works. But we take the nail as the explanation because that's the thing that we can change to fix the tire. Explanations are tools. And so if flipping the gender on the application causes the system to give another output, you have, in that classic sense of explanation, you have come up with the explanation. The thing that you can change, the one thing, and now the system's going to be better. You've gotten rid of that problem. But it's not an explanation in the sense of now we understand how the system works. And that sense of inexplicability, that we can't understand how this system works, even if it is just a handful of laws, because we can't see how they're operating. There's just too much stuff. It's too complex. There's too many tiny little pieces, each one of which is connected to in the world to everything else. That's the world that we live in. That world is not explainable, except in the sense when we need a tool. And I know this is a painful thing to say. This actually comes pretty much straight out of Heiddeger. When the sort of explanations that we use as tools, the nail, they illuminate the nail and they cast into the shadows everything else. Because you're working on the nail. You're not thinking about, oh, damn that gravity. If only there wasn't gravity. Curse you, gravity. You're focusing on the nail. Explanations highlight the one thing that you can change and unhighlight, so to speak, cast into the shadow, at least for the moment, everything else. There's a price to explanations.
So, given that if we're going to oversimplify your extraordinarily complex instance of the world as David Weinberger into some sort of tidy biographical narrative, then, you got your start as a philosophy professor. So it feels right to conclude this investigation with a question about, if all of this is about how our changing technological environment changes the way that we see the world, the way that we understand ourselves. When all of this is said and done, when your average person has intimately acquainted themselves with the everyday chaos and complexity, and it seems to me, to sort of preclude or spoil this a little bit, at least my piece of it, it seems as though the networked nature of information and experience, the internet as a medium for human psychological and cultural enactment, that it leads to, these nonlinear apprehensions of not just the interaction of parts and, their sort of the weights of their relative influence on one another, but an understanding of the self and of the changes of things, of time itself as moving out of like a linear and into a nonlinear space. And I'm curious how you think it will be for people, say, in another 50 years when this paradigm has really saturated us, as it seems likely. I mean, you've got this whole chapter on progress, our notion of progress itself becoming nonlinear, which is really apparent in the great William Gibson quote about how the future is just distributed unevenly. So it's like, I think we're still operating on a modern sense of my identity with my beginning, middle, and end, and my past causes my present, which will cause my future. And that is, like you're saying, that's an explanation that occludes all of these other things that we know to be true. So how is that understanding of who we are and where we are on a if it's even, I don't know if it's even appropriate to talk about time as a landscape, but where do you imagine this might find a new equilibrium? What's the new steady paradigm for the next interval before the next major technological disruption?
I mean, how would I know? I mean, it's a damn good question.
There it is.
So, yeah. I mean, I don't mean that as I mean it completely literally. I mean, I don't know. I would be happy if we are entering an era, and I think we are. I can't make predictions. I don't pretend to make predictions. I'm interested in trying to understand ways in which our understanding has already changed or is, in the process of changing, but unevenly distributed. And if we are getting more comfortable with particulars than we have been, appreciating the dust as much as the sort of the pattern that the dust makes, then I think that's healthy. If, as has been happening in many fields, including in philosophy and economics and psychology and if we're coming to accept that the brain is an evolutionary artifact, is not necessarily initially and primarily attuned to telling us the truth as it is, so much as it is to enabling us to survive and have more babies, then I think that's really healthy. I think we are in a Copernican moment in terms of our understanding of who we are in the universe, going from thinking that we have a God-given, or by nature or whatever, sense of ability to understand how the world works in its inner truth. I think it's very healthy for us to back away from that. I think some, modesty and awe that's the other side of modesty, is you get more awe. Scientists are incredibly modest. They're, at least in my experience, certainly theoretically, but also in my experience, they're really aware of the limitations of what they know and the possibility that they're wrong. That sort of falsifiability is, I think, for many of us, is at the root of science. If we are able to both continue to search for the truth as best we can, but also recognize that we're small creatures in a very large universe, that was not made for us and to which we do not have special access, I think that's really healthy. And if even embracing the idea that thought is something that we do with our hands as well as with our minds, with our tools as well as with our brains, I think liberating and clarifying idea. This is the Andy Clark idea. Beyond that, so I'll say one thing beyond that, which is the thing that has fascinated me, sort of the through line, which I didn't follow on purpose, but I seem to have come back to over and over again, starting with, I'll say college, is in what may be a sort of a politically motivated fascination with structures that are loosely bound, in which there is multiple connections that are characterized not by the individuality of the entities, but by the connections among them. And that is certainly true for me politically, but in terms of structures of the world. I'm always more attracted to those structures, which doesn't mean that they're there or I'm right. It's just for whatever reason. And so the internet, my early interest in the internet was absolutely driven, I think unknowingly, by my fascination and desire for such a world. And seeing that repeated in the sorts of models that machine learning makes for itself continues for me that fascination. If from this evolution we get to the point where we see truth, value, and beauty in connections, as opposed to taking the individual as the fundamental unit of matter, well, not of matter, but politically and in terms of definitions and meaning, then I will be very happy. I won't be around to see it, but I would have been very happy.
What would you offer as advice, if you'll indulge me here, and imagine that this episode is being rediscovered by some archaeologist in another couple centuries? What do you consider evergreen advice? Whether, you find it uniquely, the possibly quaint, from that perspective centuries hence, or whether you think that this is something that will stand out as time-tested wisdom. Like what is the thing that you standing here now in 2019 would offer to someone no matter when they're listening?
I wouldn't. I'll give transient advice. One is, and I think that we've already come to this point. I think we've passed through the point generally in the population of looking at the internet and digital stuff and saying, fleeing from the overload and worrying about there's too much. And I think we have passed through that sort of panic, and that we are now we are now demanding more and more information, sort of shamelessly recognizing that we can never have enough information, and we're getting really, which I think is a really wonderful thing, especially because it's less reductive than trying to find the generalizations alike. So first thing is go for information overload, carbo load as much as you can while you can. And the second thing is something I've actually told my children. I have not given them much advice, but I have told them that everything is interesting if looked at the right level of detail. And I think this is something that the internet makes manifest, because you can go to whatever level of detail you want. Whereas in the past, you were really sort of stuck at whatever was being, written in the newspaper, in the magazines. We now know, I think many of us have found out, that everything's interesting at the right level of detail. If it's not interesting, you're at the wrong scale.
That is actually, I think, evergreen and potent. And maybe I'm dating myself to the unborn archaeologists, revealing my hopelessly archaic perspective. But that seems like at least a good place to put a pin in what I think this year would call wise. So, David, I really appreciate this. Thank you for being so willing to hop on through the recommendation of a mutual friend and for writing this book, which I obviously recommend to everybody.
Thank you so much for doing this. But by the way, I was assuming that the future archaeologists would be robots. Is that right?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot on this show is, I think along with laws, theories, and models, we may be loosening our grip on other types of concepts. And I think the concept of the human is one of those areas that's becoming more and more nebulous. The more that we adopt a kind of a cybernetic perspective on the human as merely the sort of nexus of all of these uncountable, minute inputs, then we start looking more and more like an incalculably complex machine, just as we're starting to learn that in order to make a machine with the sophistication of a human being, you have to apply evolutionary processes to it. It can't really just be designed. So I think that these two things are converging, and the human or robot question may be just puzzlingly alien to somebody in another 200 years.
Can I recommend, I know we're technically already ended, but can I recommend a book to you on that very topic?
Yeah, please.
It's called Reengineering Humanity by Brett Frischman and Evan Selinger, which is in many ways at odds with what my book does. But it's a really good book. Reengineering Humanity.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I'll leave that in because I love making reading recommendations for folks. And so thanks for giving us that extra little cherry on top.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for you ask incredibly difficult questions. So for that.
Well, I mean, that's
the right question. So they're the right question.
Thanks for listening to Future Fossils. This podcast is a part of the MindPod network, along with numerous other excellent programs. Go to mindpodnetwork.com and subscribe to them all. If you'd like to help support Future Fossils, consider giving this show a 5-star iTunes review or sharing it with someone you think might appreciate these conversations. For more episodes, show notes, copious extras including music, art, Future Fossils coloring book and book club, and more, visit patreon.com/Michael Garfield.